The gavel struck, not with the usual ceremonial courtesy that opens a Senate committee hearing, but with the sharp, decisive crack of authority trying to maintain control over a room already crackling with tension. In the ornate hearing chamber of the Russell Senate Office Building, the afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across rows of mahogany desks where senators sat flanked by aides clutching briefing documents. Cameras lined the back wall, more than usual for what had been scheduled as a routine oversight hearing on election administration. But nothing about this moment felt routine. At the witness table, Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas adjusted the microphone, her expression calm but alert, like a prosecutor who'd walked into court knowing exactly which piece of evidence would crack the case wide open. Behind her, gallery seats filled beyond capacity with staffers, journalists, and advocacy group representatives who'd heard whispers that today's session might produce fireworks. Across from her, separated by 20 feet of political theater and decades of institutional power, sat Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. The 81-year-old Kentucky Republican occupied his seat with the casual authority of someone who'd spent 40 years mastering every procedural lever Congress possessed. His hands, liver-spotted and steady, rested on a leather portfolio. His face carried that familiar expression, equal parts patience and dismissal, that had become his trademark in countless confrontations. The nation was watching. Streaming platforms, cable news, social media feeds, all waiting to see what would happen when the new generation of principled firebrands collided with the old guard's institutional gatekeeping. What they were about to witness would be replayed millions of times, dissected in law schools, cited in future congressional debates, and remembered as the moment when preparation met opportunity and changed the entire conversation about American democracy. But first, there would be interruptions. To understand what was about to unfold, you had to understand the two people at its center, and why this particular collision was inevitable. Jasmine Crockett hadn't arrived in Congress by accident or celebrity. Before winning her seat representing Texas's 30th District, she'd spent years in the trenches as a civil rights attorney, defending voting rights cases across the South, challenging discriminatory practices in courtrooms where judges actually demanded evidence, not talking points. She'd graduated from Rhodes College and the University of Houston Law Center, but her real education came from deposing county clerks who couldn't explain why polling places in black neighborhoods had one machine while white suburbs had 15. She'd argued before federal judges. She'd pored over precinct-level data at 2 a.m. She'd interviewed elderly voters who'd been turned away from polls for missing signatures that matched perfectly. That experience had given her something rare in modern politics, the ability to speak with both moral clarity and forensic precision. Her colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus knew her reputation. "Don't debate Jasmine on voting rights unless you've actually read the case law," one had joked during her freshman orientation. She'll cite page numbers. McConnell's path to power had been completely different. First elected to the Senate in 1984, he'd risen through the ranks not through charisma or soaring rhetoric, but through mastery of procedure. He understood that in the Senate, the person who controls the rules controls the outcome. He'd perfected the art of the strategic interruption, the procedural objection, the parliamentary inquiry that derailed momentum and ran out the clock. His colleagues called him the Grim Reaper because legislation went to his desk to die. He wore the nickname with pride. Over 4 decades, McConnell had developed patterns. When younger members, especially women, especially people of color, began making arguments that threatened Republican priorities, he had a toolkit. Interrupt early to establish dominance, question their understanding of complex issues, cite obscure precedents, and if necessary, appeal to the chairman to move on in the interest of time. It had worked for years. Intimidation wrapped in institutional courtesy. Today, he would deploy that toolkit against someone who'd spent her career dismantling exactly that kind of tactic in courtrooms where judges don't tolerate bluster without evidence. The issue bringing them into collision was the Freedom to Vote Act. Legislation designed to establish national standards for voter access, require paper ballot backups, and restore protections gutted by the Supreme Court's 2013 Shelby County decision. For Crockett, it represented the culmination of everything she'd fought for as an attorney. For McConnell, it threatened to federalize elections he believed should remain under state control. But this wasn't just about policy disagreements. It was about who gets to speak with authority, whose evidence counts, and whether institutional power could still silence inconvenient truths. The chamber had filled with that particular electricity that precedes historic moments, the sense that something more than the scheduled agenda was about to happen. And then Crockett began to speak. "Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this critical hearing," Crockett began, her voice clear and steady. "I want to start by presenting data that demonstrates why the Freedom to Vote Act isn't just necessary. It's constitutionally urgent." She pulled up her first exhibit on the chamber's display screens, a county-by-county breakdown of polling place closures across 6 states following the Shelby County decision. Between 2013 and 2023, these 6 states closed 1,688 polling locations. Now, that number alone is striking, but what's more revealing is the pattern of where these closures occurred. Her laser pointer moved across the map, highlighting counties in red. Counties with majority black populations experience closures at a rate 3.7 times higher than majority white counties, even when controlling for population size and... McConnell's voice cut through like a blade. "Mr. Chairman, if I may." The committee chairman, a centrist Democrat trying to maintain decorum, nodded. The senator from Kentucky is recognized for a question. McConnell leaned forward slightly, his expression suggesting patient correction of a student who'd misread the assignment. "The representative is presenting correlation as causation," he said, his Kentucky drawl somehow making disagreement sound like a civics lesson. Polling place consolidations occur for many reasons: budget constraints, facility availability, staffing shortages. To suggest, as the representative seems to be doing, that these are racially motivated decisions is to make a serious charge without serious evidence. Several Republican senators nodded. In the gallery, conservative journalists typed furiously. It was a classic McConnell move. Interrupt early, reframe the argument as overreach, cast himself as the voice of reason against partisan hyperbole. The chairman turned to Crockett. "Representative, would you like to respond briefly before continuing?" Crockett didn't look rattled. If anything, a slight smile crossed her face, the expression of someone who'd expected exactly this. "I appreciate the senator's concern for evidentiary rigor," she said, her tone respectful but firm. "Which is why my next 3 slides present multivariate regression analysis controlling for precisely the factors he mentioned: county budgets, facility availability, and staffing levels across a 10-year period." She advanced to the next slide, which displayed statistical models that would have been at home in a peer-reviewed journal. Even after controlling for these variables, the disparity in closure rates remains statistically significant at the p-0.1 level. I'd be happy to provide the senator with the full methodology, which was conducted by researchers at MIT and Stanford, and has been peer-reviewed. A few committee members raised their eyebrows. This wasn't the usual congressional testimony of cherry-picked anecdotes and partisan talking points. This was actual scholarship. McConnell's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Crockett had just signaled that she wasn't going to be intimidated by his authority, and that she'd come prepared for exactly the challenges he would raise. She continued, building her case with the methodical precision of a prosecutor laying out evidence for a jury. For the next 12 minutes, Crockett presented a devastating case. She showed how voter purge rates had accelerated in jurisdictions no longer subject to federal preclearance. She presented testimony from elderly voters who'd been disenfranchised by sudden changes to ID requirements. She quoted Republican state legislators' own words from legislative sessions, revealing explicit discussions of how certain provisions would reduce turnout in urban areas. The room had grown quieter as she spoke, the weight of accumulated evidence creating an almost physical pressure. Then she pivoted to the constitutional framework. The Shelby County decision didn't rule that Congress lacks authority to protect voting rights, she explained, pulling up the relevant Supreme Court opinion. Chief Justice Roberts specifically wrote that Congress may draft another formula based on current conditions. The Freedom to Vote Act does exactly. Mr. Chairman. McConnell's interruption came sharper this time, with less performative courtesy. I must object to the representative's characterization of Shelby County. He didn't wait for recognition, simply pressing forward with the authority of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. The Supreme Court's decision was unambiguous. The pre-clearance formula was unconstitutional because it treated states differently based on outdated data. The notion that Congress can simply craft a new formula ignores the fundamental federalism concerns the court raised. States have legitimate interests in running their own elections, and the representative's dismissal of those interests in favor of federal overreach demonstrates a troubling misunderstanding of constitutional balance. His tone carried an edge now, the frustration of someone whose usual tactics weren't working as smoothly as expected. The chamber tensed. This was no longer a procedural interruption but a direct challenge to Crockett's competence. The chairman looked uncomfortable. Senator McConnell, the representative still has time remaining. Perhaps we could— But Crockett was already responding, and something in her voice made the chairman fall silent. Senator, with respect, I've argued voting rights cases before the 5th, 6th, and 11th Circuit Courts of Appeals, she said, her tone still measured but now carrying steel beneath the courtesy. I'm intimately familiar with Shelby County and its progeny. She pulled up the exact page of the Supreme Court decision. The court struck down the coverage formula in Section 4B as outdated. But Justice Roberts wrote explicitly, and I quote, Congress may draft another formula based on current conditions. That's page 2629 of the slip opinion. The dissent argued that the existing record already justified pre-clearance, but the majority didn't question Congress's constitutional authority under the 14th and 15th Amendments to enact new protections based on current evidence. She paused, making direct eye contact with McConnell. The Freedom to Vote Act is based on current evidence, the evidence I'm presenting today, which documents systematic barriers erected in the decades since Shelby was decided. That's not federal overreach. That's Congress exercising its explicit constitutional enforcement powers. Several legal scholars watching from the gallery nodded in recognition. This wasn't spin. This was sophisticated constitutional analysis delivered with the confidence of someone who'd actually litigated these issues. McConnell's face had taken on a harder expression. His interruptions weren't achieving their usual effect. If anything, they were giving Crockett opportunities to demonstrate mastery that made his challenges look weak. But he had one more card to play, one that had silenced critics before. Crockett moved to her closing evidence, a series of comparative charts showing how modern voting restrictions paralleled tactics from earlier eras of voter suppression. When we look at the mechanism of disenfranchisement, she began, we see troubling echoes of, Mr. Chairman, this has gone far enough. McConnell's interruption came with an emotional force rarely seen from the normally calculated senator. He wasn't just objecting to procedure, he was angry. The representative continues to present desperate impact as if it demonstrates discriminatory intent. She ignores the legitimate interests states have in securing their elections and ensuring voter confidence. And now, his voice rose slightly. She appears ready to compare reasonable election security measures to Jim Crow segregation. That comparison isn't just wrong. It's deeply offensive to those who actually lived through that period of American history. The chamber went completely silent. It was a devastating accusation, wrapped in moral indignation. McConnell had just accused Crockett of trivializing genuine historical suffering for political points, a charge that, if it landed, would discredit everything she'd presented. Journalists in the gallery stopped typing, recognizing they were watching a make-or-break moment. Would Crockett retreat from the comparison? Would she get defensive? Would McConnell's moral authority, as someone who'd been in politics since the 1970s, overwhelm her evidence. The chairman cleared his throat. Representative Crockett, would you like to respond to the senator's concerns? Every camera in the room focused on Crockett's face. She took a slow, deliberate sip of water, organized her papers with careful precision, and then, instead of remaining seated as protocol suggested, she stood. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd been preparing for exactly this moment her entire professional life. Senator McConnell, Crockett began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the chamber, I want to address your concerns directly, because they go to the heart of why we're here today. She walked to the document table and picked up a folder. You expressed concern about my comparison to Jim Crow-era tactics. So let me be precise. I've brought sworn affidavits from 3 individuals who lived through Jim Crow segregation and have explicitly drawn these parallels themselves. She placed 3 documents on the display stand. Reverend James Lawson, 93 years old, who marched in Selma, Ms. Amelia Boone Robinson, 89, who registered voters in Mississippi during Freedom Summer, and Mr. Isaiah Carter, 91, who was beaten attempting to vote in Alabama in 1963. The room was absolutely silent. Their testimony, entered into today's record, describes how the mechanisms have changed but the effect remains the same. Poll taxes became exact match signature requirements. Literacy tests became strict ID laws that reject student IDs but accept gun licenses. Grandfather clauses became purges of infrequent voters. She looked directly at McConnell. So, with respect, Senator, I'm not trivializing their experience. I'm honoring their testimony. McConnell shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting this response. But Crockett was just beginning. You distinguished between discriminatory intent and desperate impact. So, let me address intent. She pulled up new documents on the screen, transcripts from state legislative sessions. These are excerpts from closed-door meetings in 3 state legislatures considering voting restrictions. In North Carolina, legislators discussed how certain provisions would reduce turnout in urban areas. Their words. In Texas, analysis presented to lawmakers explicitly modeled the racial impact of ID requirements. In Georgia, emails between election officials discussed how Sunday voting restrictions would affect souls to the polls turnout. She paused, letting the implications sink in. I've provided these transcripts to every committee member. The intent is documented. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Several journalists were frantically texting editors. This was major news. On the question of legitimate state interests in election security, Crockett continued, I've submitted testimony from 34 state election officials, Republicans and Democrats, confirming there's no evidence of the widespread fraud these laws claim to prevent. She displayed another chart. In-person voter fraud, the only kind these ID laws could theoretically prevent, occurs at a rate of 0.0003%, according to the Brennan Center's analysis of 1 billion votes cast. You're more likely to be struck by lightning twice than to encounter in-person voter fraud. Now, her tone sharpened. So, we're creating barriers that disproportionately affect elderly voters, students, and people of color, documented fact, to prevent a problem that doesn't exist, also documented fact. If that's not discrimination, what would you call it? But then, Crockett did something unexpected. Her voice softened, and she addressed the elephant in the room. Now, Senator McConnell, I need to address something else. This is the 3rd time you've interrupted my testimony today. McConnell's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected this turn. So I did some research. I analyzed transcripts from the last 15 hearings where voting rights were discussed. On average, you interrupted female senators 4.1 times per hearing, compared to 1.2 times for male senators. You interrupted senators of color 3.9 times per hearing, compared to 1.4 times for white senators. She pulled up a graph showing the data with color-coded bars. Now, I'm not suggesting intent here, Senator, to borrow your own framework. I'm simply noting a pattern of desperate impact. Perhaps you don't realize you're doing it, but the effect is the same. Voices attempting to present evidence about voting barriers are themselves being systematically interrupted and silenced. Scattered applause broke out in the gallery before the chairman's gavel restored order. But the damage, or rather the truth, had been delivered. Crockett's voice took on the cadence of someone making a closing argument. This isn't about partisan advantage. It's about constitutional duty. The 15th Amendment states clearly, "The right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." And then it says, "Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." She emphasized each word of the enforcement clause. That's not a suggestion. It's a command. When barriers arise, intentional or not, Congress has a constitutional obligation to act. The evidence I've presented today demonstrates those barriers exist. The legal authority is explicit. The moral imperative is undeniable. She gathered her papers and looked one final time at McConnell, her expression not triumphant but resolute. So, with all due respect, Senator, the question isn't whether this legislation represents federal overreach. The question is whether we'll fulfill our constitutional duty to protect the fundamental right upon which all other rights depend, or whether we'll find technical excuses to avoid that duty because its beneficiaries don't look like those who've historically held power. The chamber erupted. The chairman's gavel struck repeatedly as scattered applause mixed with gasps and urgent conversations. Cameras captured every angle: Crockett's steady composure, McConnell's reddened face, committee members' stunned expressions. When order was finally restored, the chairman turned to McConnell for his response. The minority leader, for once in his 4-decade career, appeared at a loss. He shuffled papers, glanced at his aides who had nothing to offer. Finally, he simply said, "Mr. Chairman, I believe we have other business to attend to." It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a retreat. The hearing adjourned 10 minutes later, but nobody in that room had any doubt about what they'd witnessed. A changing of the guard, captured in real time, as moral clarity and meticulous evidence overwhelmed institutional power. Within 2 hours, Fourth Reply was trending nationwide. Within 4 hours, every major news network had legal analysts explaining the significance of Crockett's constitutional arguments. Within 6 hours, the full hearing video had been viewed 8 million times. Constitutional law professors assigned the exchange as required viewing. "This is how you argue equal protection claims," one Harvard professor told students. "With evidence, legal precision, and moral force in equal measure." Political scientists noted something more fundamental. Crockett hadn't just won a debate, she'd changed the terms of the conversation. Republicans who'd been planning to oppose the Freedom to Vote Act with talking points about federal overreach suddenly found their arguments pre-refuted by someone who'd addressed every objection with documented evidence. Within 48 hours, 3 Republican senators announced they were reviewing the record and open to discussion on voting protections, code words for retreat. State legislatures in Georgia and Arizona quietly shelved pending voting restriction bills, with sponsors citing concerns about legal vulnerability. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund reported $4.2 million donations in 3 days, with donor notes reading, "Because of what Jasmine said," and "Evidence matters." McConnell's office released a terse statement about respectful disagreement and ongoing dialogue, the political equivalent of declining to comment. Meanwhile, Crockett's phone rang with calls from Senate leadership, advocacy groups, and law schools requesting speaking engagements. But when reporters caught her in a Capitol hallway, she deflected. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about whether we honor the Constitution's promise or find excuses to abandon it. The evidence is clear. Now Congress has to act." Historians would later point to this exchange as emblematic of a broader shift in American political discourse. For decades, institutional power had been able to dismiss challenges through procedural dominance and appeals to tradition. But Crockett represented a new generation that came equipped with expertise, data, and moral clarity that couldn't be interrupted away. She'd done what seemed impossible in modern politics. She'd changed minds with evidence. More importantly, she'd exposed how institutional gatekeeping often works, not through reasoned argument but through interruption, dismissal, and the subtle suggestion that certain voices aren't credible enough to demand serious engagement. By documenting McConnell's pattern of interruption and presenting it alongside her voting rights evidence, she'd revealed how process suppression mirrors voter suppression, both designed to silence voices that threaten the status quo. The fourth reply hadn't just answered McConnell's objections, it had dismantled an entire approach to political combat, replacing it with something more powerful: evidence, persistence, and the moral authority that comes from actually knowing what you're talking about. In an era of sound bites and gotcha moments, Jasmine Crockett had done something radical. She'd prepared, she'd brought receipts, she'd refused to be intimidated, and she'd proven that sometimes truth actually does overwhelm institutional power, if the person speaking truth knows exactly what they're fighting for and exactly how to fight for it. The gavel had struck to end the hearing. But what it really ended was the assumption that power and position could substitute for evidence and principle. A new chapter had begun, and everyone watching knew it. If this story moved you, if you believe truth deserves witnesses, hit like, share this video, and subscribe. Because moments like these don't just happen, they're fought for. And they only matter if enough of us remember what we saw and demand more of it from those we elect to serve.